Okay. So this presentation is a little bit of a follow-on from control of the center, the previous one, and we're going to look at active pieces and activity here. And I say it's a follow-on because active pieces will frequently have control of the center, but not always. You can have an active piece from the edge of the board, especially the long-range pieces. But what we're looking at here is the idea that your pieces have options, that they're doing stuff, that they're active. As compared to pieces that are blocked in, cramped, very few squares, and perhaps not working together very, very well. And sometimes this idea might be called in a chess book having the initiative. And sometimes a player will be prepared to sacrifice some material, maybe give up a pawn or two, or perhaps sacrifice the exchange, give up a rook for a bishop and pawn or a knight and pawn, whatever, something like that. But in order to create a position where their pieces are active and they have the initiative. So let's see some example positions and try to work out what we mean by active and passive. So have a look at the position below. And who do you think has the more active pieces? So we could count the number of legal moves, which can give you a guide. We did in the previous presentation, but actually, eventually, you'll just recognize who has the more active position anyway, just from experience. And hopefully, it should be reasonably obvious that black is the more active player in this position. So you can count the pieces. Everyone has everything left. There's still 8 pawns and all the pieces, blah, 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 blah. That's fine. And the black pieces are all quite nicely developed. You can see the 2 bishops are sort of pointing towards the white king. The 2 knights are centralized. Black's castled. Once the queen moves in a minute, then the 2 rooks will be connected. And black's got pawns in the center of the board. So it's pretty good. Fine. The white pieces, although the game is far from lost, right? White isn't losing, but the pieces are inactive. They're passive. They're blocking each other in. For example, the knight on b1 has no moves at all. The rook on a1 has 1 move to a2, and it's really not any use whatsoever. The bishop on c1 currently has no moves. The knight on e1 can go to c2. It's just crammed. There's just nothing there for white. So although we're level here on material, on pieces, yeah, the advantage in this position, slight advantage, lies with black, and that's because of the activity of the pieces. So I'm going to show a slightly dramatic example of activity and initiative in an opening called the Danish Gambit. And if you play this computer versus computer, black will be able to defend against this gambit, but between 2 human beings, it's really dangerous and quite good fun to play. And what happens is white sacrifices 2 pawns to get all the pieces out quickly. All this pieces I've put there. I think that should say the pieces, but it doesn't matter. So if black gives back the pawns, or one of the pawns at least, probably both at the right time, then can defend the position reasonably comfortably, but it's a complicated game. So let's just take a look so you can see what I mean by initiative. So play the moves on your board. So e4 and e5, d4, and pawn takes pawn, so that's e takes d4. And now instead of queen takes d4, which is fine, the center game, and black would probably play something like knight c6, and white would move the queen. But instead of that, white plays c3. And what this allows black to do is take another pawn. So it's called gambit, and black plays d takes c3, why not? And now again, white can play knight takes c3 and has sacrificed a pawn for a slight lead in development. But in the Danish gambit, white plays bishop to c4. And if black feels really brave, it can then take a second pawn. So c takes b2, bishop takes b2. And now you should hopefully have this position. And what you can see now is a really fascinating evaluation in chess. So white's got both bishops developed in the center of the board, or pointing to the center of the board. We've got a pawn in the middle of the board. The white queen is ready to come into the game. The knights are ready to develop, and white can be castled within 2 or 3 moves. So lots going on. Black has moved absolutely nothing except 1 pawn, and that pawn is no longer on the board. There's no pieces developed. Black isn't really near to castling, and only one of the bishops is ready to come out. So white can definitely be said here to have an initiative. The compensation for black, of course, is that black has 2 pawns more. So the question becomes then is, does white have enough for having given up 2 pawns? Is this lead in development enough to win the game? And it can be quite good fun when you've got a friend to play with to try going from this position with black to move. I believe that the best move, the soundest move, is actually d5 now, is to move the queen's pawn forward a couple of squares and just to give back one of these extra pawns that you have as black. And that's just because it forces white to waste a move taking the pawn. So you play bishop takes pawn, which is fine. But then what that's done is it's given black some time to play a move like knight to f6 maybe, or to develop the bishops, possibly bishop b4 check. There's things that black can be doing at that point. But it's very, very interesting. So you see this is the difference between a really active position, plenty of development and control of the center, and a position that's rather cramped and rather underdeveloped. Let's have a look at some more. So we've got another one here. So who's active and who's passive in this case? If you want to hit pause and have a think, feel free. But hopefully you've come to the conclusion that black is the active player here. So white's allowed black to occupy the center with the 2 pawns and d5 and e5, and hasn't yet tried to counterattack that, although at some point white would probably want to play c4 and start to attack that center. And the black pieces definitely have more room to move around, don't they? If you look, for example, at the white bishop on f1, how do we get that bishop developed? Until we can get that bishop developed, how do we get castled? Black's just about to castle and is pretty much ready to start doing whatever evil, dastardly plan he wants to. So whilst the game is a long way from lost, you know, white's not losing this by any means, we can definitely say that black has an advantage because of the more active position. So have another look now, at this position. This comes about as a fairly typical Sicilian defense position. Feel free to press pause and see what you think, but based on what we've seen so far, who would you say has an advantage here in terms of activity and why? Okay, so this time, not a huge amount to choose between the sides, actually. Slight advantage to white, probably, and that's typically the case coming out of the opening anyway, because white has the first move, so white should have the slightest of advantages from the opening. A little more space in the center because of the pawns on e4 and f3. Black's only got the d6 pawn. But the black pieces are quite well developed. The black king is safe. The black rook has that nice c file pointing towards the knight on c3. And the bishop on g7 as well is on a rather nice diagonal. Sometimes in the Sicilian defense, you'll see black will play rook takes knight on c3 when that bishop is also pointing at c3 to make an exchange sacrifice to mess up the white pawns. Or black is ready to start pushing the B and A pawns forward as an attack called a minority attack. So yeah, you'd probably say slight advantage to white here, but nothing dramatic, nothing that you wouldn't expect, nothing out of the ordinary from a typical opening. Okay, so that's a very brief look at activity. It's very, I can't think of the word, subjective maybe, how you would analyze a position. So really it's a question of your own judgment and experience as to decide what you think is active, what you think is passive. But generally speaking, in chess, you're going to want to give your pieces as many options as you can to be as active as possible and to try to restrict the activity of the opposition. So that's one plan that you can make when you're not able to find pins and forks and checks and captures that are useful, is can you do anything about increasing the activity of your own pieces and or decreasing the activity of the opposition ones. Okay, let's leave that there for the time being then. Good luck with your games.